Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, with your host Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
We are recording, I take it.
Yes, we are. We are on the air.
Hello,
brother.
Mike. You're looking chipper today. I understand as I look out at this most beautiful spring day, going to be in the high 70s and just terrific. It's snowing in Missoula, Montana on April the 17th.
Oh, rub it in. Just rub it in.
Which is not unusual, is it, for this time of year?
But... No, spring and winter, duke it out. Yeah. Yeah.
Who's in control?
Yeah. Right now, winter is.
So welcome, everyone, to Truth Be Told. Today is April the 17th, 2024, and we are in session 93 today.
Wow.
And we decided to do, it's kind of a last minute. So as you will find out, this will not be the most highly organized session. Some of it will be haphazard and off the cuff, and you watching this will say, well, isn't that like every video I watch of yours? So
yes.
But we decided to go backwards. We're in Deuteronomy, but we decided to go backwards. We skipped over this, not for any particular reason, but we just don't want Braden Barnum to send us an email saying, you missed some really, really, really important stuff back in Numbers 19. How could you?
Yes.
So we're going to get a jump on the gun for Braden. And, you know, he does need to learn to respect his elders speaking to us in that tone.
I know.
But, we're going to go back to Numbers 19 and look at the story of the Red Heifer offering. One reason why we may have skipped over this when we're going through Numbers, at least for me, I don't know about you, but this whole idea of the Red Heifer offering, you know, it's not listed among the offerings in Leviticus. So it's like separated off from this. It's like this mystery offering. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was reading one person said that it's a kind of a Jewish tradition that the only thing King Solomon, the wisest man in the world, could not quite understand completely in the Torah was the red heifer offering. So if even he couldn't understand it completely,
we don't have a chance.
Yeah. There is something mysterious about it. And one of the mysteries about it is what a central role it plays in so many prophetic teachings, lessons, sermons, presentations. So I did there. And another reason I think I kind of maybe subconsciously skipped over it is because most of my life, certainly most of my ministry, there's this constant every year or so, the news about, are these the red heifers? You know, right. Is this the time? Is this the one?
Yeah.
All these big predictions and these pictures and videos and this is it, you know. And another part of the mystery is what about it that ties it so closely into the rebuilt temple, the 70th week of Daniel, the renewal of the sacrifices for Israel during that time. Why is this red heifer offering so important to that? And I've kind of developed a feeling, I could be way off on this, but I've kind of developed at least a question. You know, some of these things, you wonder does it really have a close connection to the end times, the rebuilt temple, the 70th week, because the Bible teaches that? Or has it become so much a part of that because of the many, many additions that the Jews have built into their religion through the years, and that Christian prophetic teachers have grabbed hold of and given it an importance that maybe the Bible does not? So in that sense, is a lot of this hype and buildup about the red heifer offering, will that be part of the deception of the 70th week and of Antichrist? Or are we to understand it as a vital part, a good part of prophecy of that time? And so those kind of questions have swirled around in my mind through the years. And I think that's one reason why, again, subconsciously, I think I kind of avoided it when we were going through Numbers, because there's so much hype. You go on the internet, you can just find dozens and dozens of videos and lessons, and everyone has a prediction about the red heifer offering, that it just gets to be overwhelming. And you think, well, what is the truth about the red heifer offering? So we're going to try to look into that a little bit today.
Well, I have a question that was raised in my mind as well. And it ties into your thought of, is this just some kind of a tradition that's grown and grown? Or is it, does it have some biblical substance to it? Let's just say that it's a tradition or a hope that Israel has developed over the years, this mystique, okay? That's all it will take for them to accept, because my understanding is that the temple services cannot be reinstated until this cleansing happens first. Okay. So when we look into the Bible and we see that the temple will be reconstructed, well, in order for services to begin there, somebody, and they're expecting the Messiah to be the one to kick this off. Okay, so I think I read or heard where 9 red heifers have been in their history from Moses on forward to the destruction of the second temple. So they're looking at Messiah to then offer the 10th. So if this Messiah is offering the 10th red heifer, and that initiates the service then to begin again, and Jesus hasn't come back yet, then who is it that's presenting himself as Messiah to offer this offering? Because we see temple services have begun. You know what I'm saying? It's well underway.
Which then answers my earlier question. It is tied to both the necessity of it happening for prophecy to be fulfilled in the 70th week, but also it's part of the deception, because Israel will be deceived by it.
Well, if they think he's Messiah, he's just provided the red heifer as Messiah. They're good with that. So temple services begin, and then he turns out that he's not Messiah.
Well, we know that the red heifer offering itself, we'll look at Numbers 19 in just a minute. But I was thinking of that verse over in Daniel 8, and it's 11 through 14, where it's talking about the abomination of desolation. The daily sacrifices are taken away. And the question is, how long? Verse 13 and verse 14 says 2,300 days. So then that is a huge debate as to what is that 2,300 days that the sanctuary will be cleansed. So we're talking about the cleansing that will be necessary for their sanctuary, whatever that will look like. It may not, the second temple under Zerubbabel, they wept because it was not near like the Solomon's temple. But it was still the temple. So it's whatever this temple will not have to be even like a full-size temple. Remember when Zerubbabel first came back, first thing they did was build the altar. Let me see if I can find that verse real quick. And they, I may be getting my stories mixed up. between Ezra and Nehemiah. Yeah, in Ezra 3, they built the altar and started their sacrifices again, even before the temple was built. We can even go before the first temple to the tabernacle, which was a smaller, less elaborate, less complex structure, and yet it was the house of God. So, this whole idea of the rebuilt temple, I think people make a mistake when they try to force it to be like a full-fledged Solomon's temple rebuilt. It could just be a simple structure. I think the main thing is that it's on the Temple Mount, in the area of where the temple was, and that they are able to practice their religion on the Temple Mount again.
Yes.
That's the heart of it.
Yeah.
So, we may be trying to make too much of what it must look like. And so this session is probably going to be chasing a bunch of rabbits because all kinds of thoughts come to my mind. I was noticing the, attack of Iran on Israel over the last weekend. And some of the pictures were showing a bunch of missiles right over Jerusalem that were being knocked out by the Iron Dome. And that some of those missiles were said to be possibly headed toward the Temple Mount. And so if they were, even by design or by accident, either one, a couple of thoughts came to my mind that I thought was very interesting. One interesting thought was, did Israel, in effect, protect the Muslim mosque and the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount by knocking those missiles out? Did they actually protect the Muslim site? And if they did, will that cause some of the more moderate Muslims to be more favorable toward Israel having access to the Temple Mount? Some have suggested that the way it's going to happen is that part of the agreement will be the Muslims will be allowed use of it on Fridays and the Jews on Saturdays, and maybe even the Christians on Sundays. The idea is that maybe those three descendant from Abraham religions, monotheistic religions, having their worship day on separate days might be used by God to fulfill prophecy, by that being part of the solution. Is that let each religion have access on their particular holy day. It may be something that simple. But, and part of the reason that may be agreed to is that Israel might be seen as they actually were our protector of our holy site by knocking out those missiles, because Iran, being Shia Muslim, is kind of disliked by most of the Muslim countries. And it wouldn't be past Iran to possibly even attempt to knock out that holy site, to thumb their nose at the other Muslim nations that they think are heretics, being Sunni Muslims. So we just don't know quite how all this is going to work out. What if Israel responds, and they might in the next few days, even before some of you watch this video, and then Iran responds again with more missiles this time, and Iran actually succeeds in knocking out that Muslim holy site on the Temple Mount, and that will lead to Israel being allowed to be part of the rebuilding of that Temple Mount with part of their holy site.
Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah, I mean, you start thinking about how all of this may be worked out. And wouldn't it be something if it was a Muslim nation, even though it's Iran that most of them dislike? Wouldn't it be something if it was a Muslim nation that brought that about by sending missiles on the Temple Mount?
How ironic.
And that Israel responds by wiping out Iran, or some big response, that Israel will be seen almost as like the hero to some of the Middle East Muslim nations for attacking the one who attacked their holy site. So you think of different scenarios, and we just don't quite know. But what happened over the weekend did help add to the possibilities of how it may be worked out.
Yeah. You know, this one thing I also heard, they were tying it to why Hamas attacked Israel. And I don't know if this is just, rumors or such, but, all these things start to come to surface. But one of the reasons I heard that Hamas attacked Israel is that they got wind that Israel was raising red heifers somewhere in Israel. Well, this one video says that they're in Shiloh, that there's a small herd of red heifers that were transported from Texas into Israel, five, I believe it was, for $500,000. So those cows are $100,000 a piece. Of course, they have to be inspected, but they're being inspected by Israel there in Shiloh, as the report goes. But what's interesting is when they heard that Israel was raising these red heifers, they know that that's a harbinger to the temple, because they know Israel has to have the red heifer to initiate the cleansing of the temple.
Sure,
and so they
yeah.
put all this together, and so they're stirring the pot, as it were, to try to prevent this from the temple from being built. And whether or not this is of God or biblical, it only matters that Israel believes it, because Israel will act on what they think is the right thing to do.
Exactly. And it matters what the Islamics think. In other
Yes.
words, Islam may not be Jewish biblical scholars, but they know what the Jews think,
Mm-hmm.
and they know what the Christians think. I mean, they read books,
Yes.
they have internet.
Yeah.
So they read all this and they conclude, well, we can't let this proceed because this is what they plan to do with it, and we've got to stop it. So yeah, it seems very reasonable. And Iran told Hamas to take care of it.
Even the priesthood. I heard two things. One, that the priests, the Kohen, have a chromosome marker on the DNA level that satisfies Israel anyway, that they are a continuation of a legitimate priesthood. Okay. And so whether or not that's the actual fact, and whether or not that's important to God, as long as it's important to Israel and they believe there's a legitimate priesthood in place, that's all that matters for them to proceed with this whole idea of the temple, the priesthood, the altar, to the whole thing, just to keep rolling forward. It's just a matter of, if they believe it, that's good enough.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what Jesus faced the first coming.
Yeah.
I think in Matthew 23, he told them, you tithe mint and anise, and you're very, very detailed and scrupulous about making sure you pay a tithe on every single little spice in your house, every single little, very, very strict. He said you omit the weightier matters of the law.
Yeah.
Justice and mercy and all of those things. And so the Orthodox Jews in Israel today are just descendants of the Pharisees. They're very, very strict about keeping the details of how they interpret the law, the Torah. And so it may not have anything to do with true spirituality or service to God. It does in their mind. They just feel like they're, like those red heifers, and you and I have read some of the same stories. They inspect them all the time. If they find even one or two white hairs, they're disqualified. Yeah. So they're down to the very number of hairs on the red heifers. Yeah. That every single hair has to be red. So we're being strict according to the Torah. Oh, but we did reject Jesus as Messiah. The weightier matters.
Right. If it was me, I'd carry a pair of tweezers in my pocket.
And that 2,300 days there in Daniel 8:14, part of the debate is, what's the starting point? So some say, well, the starting point is the middle of the 7 years. And so it goes into the millennial, and that is the cleansing. This is predicting the cleansing of the millennial temple. It's a number of months into the millennial. Others say, no, this is the Jewish temple built to renew their sacrificial system, their religious system, and it will be toward the beginning of the 7 years. And how that can be reached, and I've thought this is a possibility, is that you take 2,520 days, which is the 7 years in the Jewish calendar time, and you deduct 2,300 days from it, you have 220 days. So what I'm doing is I'm going to the end of the 7 years and counting backwards. And that 220 days is a very interesting number, because in Jewish 30-day months, 220 days would be the 7th month, the 10th day of the month. So what is that? Well, that's the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, Yom Kippur.
So part of the thinking might be that the agreement is signed around Passover, the beginning of their religious year, and they get busy rebuilding whatever that temple will look like, get everything in order, and this would be very Jewish, very Orthodox Jewish thinking, that they already have the Day of Atonement date set as when we want to officially begin, because that would have, great symbolism to them. And so this 2,300 days working backwards on the Day of Atonement, 7 months and 10 days into the 7 years or 70th week, might be when they consider the temple of that time cleansed, not the millennial temple, but the temple of that treaty that's signed. So, however it's going to be worked out, we all like to think about the possibilities. Now, the fortunate thing for us is that Daniel does close in Daniel 12, verse 10 and 11 by saying, none of the wicked will understand, but the wise will understand. So we will be given special insight, wisdom, knowledge, that at that time we will understand how all of it is being worked out. We're just kind of conjecture ahead of time, because it's not the time to know yet.
And that's how the elect will not be deceived, because of the wisdom that they have.
But almost,
going into it.
Jesus said, if it were possible, he would deceive the very elect. So that means the vast majority will be deceived. And the elect will come along and say, no, this is the truth of the matter. And they'll say, lean over this chopping block, we're going to cut off your head.
That's right. Yes.
So let's go into the red heifer a little bit more. And one reason I brought up that 2,300 days working backwards would be the Day of Atonement is, let me see, I think I've written the verses down here somewhere. Let me find it. Yeah, okay. I'll just give the verses. We won't take the time to read them. But in 1 Kings 8 and 2, Solomon, well, I actually, I'm going to lie to myself. I'm going to go over and read that real quick, because I think it's worthwhile to bring this idea out. In 1 Kings 8, the temple had been finished. In verse 1, the ark is brought into the temple. And then in verse 2, therefore all the men of Israel assembled with King Solomon at the feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. So that Solomon's temple was dedicated in the 7th month. And then we go to Ezra chapter 3 in verse 1. And when the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem, and their worship was restored in Jerusalem in the 7th month. As it goes on to talk about, they built an altar, offered offerings. I mentioned that earlier. But when did it happen? In the 7th month. So the idea is that this third temple, whatever form it will take, Jews are very big on the holy feast days and doing things according to the importance of their calendar, the importance of their history. So it would just make natural sense that they would purposely choose the 7th month to initiate whatever temple they build at the beginning of the 7 years. And so the 7th month idea is real important in their mind. And I think that's exactly what they would follow in this restored temple. And so that means the process would start before that, of course. There's a number of things about this Numbers 19, the red heifer, that I want to point out. Because before we get too far along in speculation and a lot of these things we're trying to figure out, a core purpose of our sessions is to look for Christ in the Old Testament. And you notice the language of Numbers 19 that point to Christ. Verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, this is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they bring you a red heifer without blemish. So, of course, that applies. Peter talks about there's a lamb without blemish. And he was the spotless Lamb of God, and so on and so forth. But this is the idea of an animal getting ready to be sacrificed that had no blemish, in which there was no defect. And of course, Christ had no defect, in which a yoke has never come. How would you apply that to Christ? There's something there I probably should have thought about it a little bit more. We'll think about that as we go along. And then verse 3 is a big one. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest, that he may take it outside the camp. So, of course, Hebrews 9:13. Is it 9:13? Hebrews 9:13. Somebody have that in mind. No, that's talking about 9:13 is the blood of bulls and goats and ashes of a heifer. So even the Hebrew writer speaks about this red heifer offering as if it was a real common understanding among them. And then it talks about the purifying of the flesh. So we know that the red heifer offering is for the purpose of purification. And of course, the only total purification of our sins and our blemishes and our defects is the blood of Christ. So purification is the very essence of the death of Christ. But it's 13:12, isn't it? That's the one I was thinking of. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So he was outside of Jerusalem. And the red heifer was taken outside the gate of the city, or outside the temple. And I think you've read some of the same information I've been reading about this big ramp, this wooden ramp that was built leading up to an elevated altar that supposedly is going to be transported to the Mount of Olives, and that the red heifer offering may be offered on that elevated altar on that ramp in view of the temple, because that's the thing. It had to be in view of the temple, but it wasn't in the temple.
Right.
It was outside.
Yeah.
And so I think that's their thinking, and whether that's the correct thinking or not, that's what they will think is correct. They'll agree to it, and that's how it's going to be brought to pass in some way. So outside the camp, it shall be slaughtered before him. And Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, sprinkle some of its blood 7 times directly in front of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the heifer shall be burned in his side, its hide, its flesh, its blood, its offal shall be burned. In other words, total burning, total suffering the wrath of God, suffering wrath. And that's exactly what happened to Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
He suffered total wrath due to our sins and the wrath of God on sin. So there's that completeness idea. And interesting that he sprinkles the blood 7 times, that idea of completeness, perfection. Christ gave 100% of himself, as this red heifer is totally burned, representing the judgment of God on sin. And then interesting elements mentioned in verse 6. The priest shall take cedar wood. Cedar wood. So cedar was heavily used in the temple, covered with gold. Cedar wood often in the Bible represents humanity, and gold represents divinity. Christ was both. But that cedar wood, hyssop, of course, is a big deal regarding the death of Christ. Put that vinegar on that hyssop, offered it to him. Israel used hyssop to sprinkle the blood on the doorposts and lintels in Egypt. Hyssop is a symbol of, it's kind of a medicinal, but it was also used in key places to sprinkle blood or to offer relief that Jesus refused. So hyssop is the core idea about prophecies about Christ. Scarlet, of course, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. So just, the choice of language in this whole red heifer offering screams about types and shadows of Christ. So there's something real, I think maybe I've made a mistake through the years that there's been so much hype about the red heifer offering and the return of Christ and the rebuilt temple that I've let it sway me a little bit away from actually seeing the true value and good of what this red heifer offering is all about. It's a beautiful picture of Christ in so many levels.
One Hebrew scholar who's all excited about the red heifer, I was watching the video, said that the scarlet was wool. So it was a dyed wool, apparently. And so wool, of course, would speak of sheep. And if you're looking for Jesus as the lamb, of course, the red would represent his sacrifice as the lamb. Scarlet wool. Of course, he was not attributing that to Christ.
Right, of course.
Yeah. I was thinking, I keep thinking of the yoke, not under a yoke. And I'm wondering, yoke taken two ways, a literal yoke. So an instrument of burden. So Christ was never under the burden or bondage of anyone. So he was King of Kings. He was not never subjected to anyone. That's one aspect.
Okay, before you go on, let's flesh that out a little bit.
Okay.
So he was a willing servant, but a yoke speaks about with an animal forced labor. Unwilling labor. So he in Matthew 11, he take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. So he put the yoke on himself willingly, but no one forced it on him against his will. I think you're onto something here.
Yeah. And the other usage of yoke, there, you just mentioned it. Take my yoke upon you. A yoke was associated with the teaching of a rabbi. So his yoke was his discipline. And so, there were different rabbis during Jesus' day, and they had there were different schools. And so his yoke would be what he would teach his Talmudim, his disciples. And so Jesus is offering to Israel to take his yoke, his discipline, his understanding of Torah upon them, as opposed to the other disciplines or yokes presented by the other rabbis, which of course were laden with traditions of men. And so his was stripped of all that. It was pure. It was the word of God as given by the Father to Jesus. So it was a pure Torah, pure instruction.
Yeah, so that's like Peter in that famous council at Jerusalem in Acts 15. Stood up and said, why do you want to put a yoke on them that neither us nor our fathers were able to bear? Yeah. So they had added so many traditions and teachings of their own that Jesus purposely broke,
Mhm.
committed a high percentage of his healings on the Sabbath on purpose.
Mhm.
They accused him of breaking the Sabbath, and he kept saying, okay, you have an ox fall in the ditch on the Sabbath, you go get it out.
Yeah.
How much more this person who is
Yeah.
suffering
Yeah.
can be healed on the Sabbath? Is it wrong to do good on the Sabbath? So they had added so many of their own rules and regulations that made it a heavy yoke burden.
Mhm. Yeah.
And Jesus came to free them
Yeah.
from that yoke,
Yeah.
and take on my yoke, which is much different than their yoke. Yeah, I think we've kind of landed on it, Mike. Thanks. So it says in verse 6, the priest will take cedar wood, which of course wood speaks about the cross too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not just the wood in the temple, but the temple was dying on the wood of the cross because he was the temple. Hyssop and scarlet, and cast them into the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. So these items that speak so loudly about Christ are thrown into the fire of judgment, of the wrath of God. So in some real sense, we're finding more connections to Christ and his death in this red heifer offering than we even do back in the Levitical offerings in the book of Leviticus. It seems like every part of this screams out something about Christ.
And did I read in the scriptures that the red heifer had to be 3 years old, at least 3 years old? Or I'm sorry, 3 years old.
At least two, I think. Maybe at least three. Maybe it says here at some point. It says in verse 8, the one who burns it shall wash his clothes in water, bathe in water, shall be unclean till evening. Unclean till evening. So when Jesus became a curse on the cross and became sin for us, in essence, he was unclean in some sense until evening or until the time he died. He took on uncleanness. He never became unclean, but he took on our uncleanness.
Yeah.
And this priest, of which, of course, Christ is priest, shall be unclean until evening. And water is involved. Out of his side came forth blood and water. So in the story, we have a lot of mixture of blood and water. And blood and water, of course, speaks a lot about Christ. The blood cleanses us from our sins, the water of purification. Verse 9, then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, store them outside the camp in a clean place.
Another aspect was this was also for the purification of those who came into contact with the dead. And so this one guy said, if you've attended a funeral or you visited a cemetery, you've come into it doesn't mean direct contact necessarily, but his thought was that anything associated with the dead. And of course,
that's gonna go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say Jesus went down into Hades. So I mean, Jesus he was in direct contact with the dead. I don't know where that plays in, but
I was kind of going a different direction with it. And it says, then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and store them outside the camp in a clean place. I was thinking of the story of Joseph, a godly man, and Nicodemus, a godly man, took the body of Jesus. And the Gospels are very careful to say they buried him in a tomb where a man had never laid. And so a dead body had never laid in that tomb, unused. So it was not unclean.
Yeah.
So his body never came into contact with uncleanness. They immediately took him down and wrapped him.
Yeah.
And so his physical body never touched anything unclean.
In doing that, they put themselves into contact with the dead body. Did that disqualify them from that year's Passover?
Was that a question?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it depends on when you think the Passover was that year. Had they already eaten Passover?
Right. I don't think they had already eaten it. I think it was the
okay.
next day. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this verse 9, to me, my immediate picture was a man who was clean, Joseph and Nicodemus. So gather up the remains of that dead body, the ashes, and store them outside the camp in a clean place, a tomb that had never been used. I don't know. Some watching this may say, "Man, you're really uh, trying to go too far, making applications to Christ." But when you have that mindset, you start seeing it everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
don't know that I'm going too far. And they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel, for the water of purification is for purifying from sin. The one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean till evening. Till evening. So that's interesting. So evening for them was right after they buried him. So as soon as it became the next day or evening, they were
Yeah.
no longer unclean, were they?
In fact, that's why they had to hurry, because the sun was going down
Yeah.
and Sabbath, the first Sabbath was approaching.
Does that may have answered your question? Although when we get to verse 11, the one who gathers the ashes to wash his clothes be unclean till evening, and be a statute for every children of Israel to the stranger who dwells among them. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. We'll just skip right over that. He
But
shall purify.
Jesus being their Passover, he really negated for those followers. He was the replacement. And so, I mean, if you're going to follow Christ, who is our Passover, that really negated their need, in a sense, I guess, to have to follow through with the whole 7 days and all of those other things.
Mm.
They were free from that.
It's interesting, verse 12, he shall purify himself with the water on the third day and on the seventh day, and he'll be clean. So how important is the idea of a third day and a seventh day in the Bible? So, these are all extended into other areas throughout the rest of the Bible, the importance of the third day and the seventh day. But if he does not purify himself on the third day and on the seventh day, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the body of anyone who's, okay, it goes on to talk about other things. We're kind of getting away now from these are all laws of purification, the rest of the chapter, but they really don't directly talk about the red heifer. So what we're talking about, I guess, in the Jewish mind is that the red heifer offering is that which will cleanse the priest and the temple site in order for them to renew their religion on the Temple Mount. So that's why it's so important to the Jews. And of course, it's important to Christians because of prophetic significance, because we teach that when that happens, it probably will already be within the start of the 7 years, because it's the signing of that treaty that starts the 7 years. And probably part of that agreement is to allow them to do this on the Temple Mount. And if the 2,300 days is counted from the end backwards, which means the 7th month, 10th day, Day of Atonement, and that's how long it takes them from the signing of the treaty to the start of it, which again, they would naturally want it to be symbolically significant, of connected to especially a feast day like the Day of Atonement. And if that's when it happens, can you imagine in the religious world in general, not just Jewish, especially Jewish and Christian, maybe probably even Muslim, because it'd be televised around the world that the Jews have renewed their religion on their Temple Mount on this holy Day of Atonement. Do you think the world will be aware enough of the significance of that every computer and TV set and smartphone would be tuned into that event?
I would think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that as being a pivotal world event. So I have written down, let me see, I've jotted down this verse, Ezekiel 36:25. Okay, so this is, okay. Let me put this a little bit in context. So this is within the idea of the tribulation period, the 7-year period, and the goal of God at the end of it, of course, for his people is in verse 25, I will sprinkle clean water on you. So that ties into the red heifer offering we just read. You shall be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. So no wonder the Jews elevate this red heifer offering so much, as they believe that this will be the time and it will appear. Okay, so let's tie this in. The blessings and the curses back under Moses, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, that if you obey me, you will be the head of the nations. So when they offer this red heifer offering and cleanse that temple site and the priesthood, and they renew their sacrifices or their religious practices on the Temple Mount, they in some way will consider that a sign that they are obeying God. And the reason for the peace treaty is that they probably have just were on the verge of wiping out some of their enemies. And so their enemies sued for peace. This man of sin came and offered this peace treaty to Israel, and Israel demanded some of these terms of the right to the Temple Mount, and they agreed to it. And so at that point, when they renew their practice on the Temple Mount, will they see it as this is God bringing about the promise of us being the head of the nations because of our obedience to him? Because at that point, it will appear they have the upper hand.
Yeah.
Their enemies, the Antichrist and his confederation, have only reluctantly agreed to that peace treaty. So evidently, Israel, in some military or political way, has the upper hand at this point.
I'm thinking too.
They will misinterpret that whole scene as God blessing them.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, Brother Rick, but that when they reach that point, that I would think that the secular nation of Israel, which we see now, will have to have more into more of a spiritual government, not to have any interest at all in the temple and all of this. I would think that as a nation, they're going to drift closer to what are now on the fringe, Temple Mount Institute and all these other Orthodox groups. My thought is that Israel will have gone in that direction, more of a spiritual direction.
Very possibly.
By then,
Yeah. Well, we do know that the last 7 years is going to be the ultimate spiritual battle between good and evil. And going back to what you said about Hamas, why did Hamas attack on October the 7th, which was connected to the 7th month, I believe, last year? I believe that was still part of the 7th month on the Jewish calendar. Why did it happen on the Jewish 7th month? So, you say, well, Iran told him to do it because they had inkling of this red heifer and that they knew all the implications of that. But is there something deeper, darker than that going on, that that Satan knew the implications of what that would mean. If they were about to perform the red heifer offering, or he knew it was getting close, or he knew, he knew enough of the details that Satan was actually behind enticing Hamas to attack on a holy month, knowing what all this meant with the red heifer and so forth. He knew something was about to happen. Who knows? Maybe something really was about to happen that Israel was just not announcing regarding all of this. But Satan knew.
Yeah.
And he led his people to attack Israel, to stop it.
Yeah.
So, most even Christian prophetic teachers say, well, they did it to stop the Abraham Accords and the moderate Islamic nations like Saudi Arabia and so forth, Egypt maybe, from developing closer ties with Israel for the purpose of trade, commerce, prosperity. And I think that was part of it. They wanted to put a stop to it. But Satan may have seen something deeper than that. That if I allow them to go through with this is going to kick some things into it cannot be stopped.
I think there's a lot of levels here. God, of course, pulling the overall strings. Satan is a puppet underneath God's direction, and Satan's hatred for Israel to begin with. I think there's a lot of levels here, and I think God uses. We're talking earlier about Israel being motivated by their traditions and what they construe as spiritual and stuff. I think God uses even their way of thinking, and I think He ties it in with what's already on the calendar. God's feasts are on the calendar, and they mean something. The timing of these things are played out according to this huge calendar. So I think God works and weaves His will through Israel to follow traditions or whatever to in the end to get His will accomplished.
Well, we do know that the many attacks against Israel by the Muslim nations in their history, that many of those attacks were purposely done on important dates, either important dates for Muslims or important dates for Jews, like the Yom Kippur War. They did it purposely on a holy day. This October 7th was done on at least a weekly Sabbath, and more than that. But they pick dates for these attacks because they have meaning to them. And so I guess one thing we're saying is that, and I'm thinking of that verse in Psalm 2, verse 6, about election. We like to bring up that subject a lot, that a lot of what is going on is God has made some choices, and the enemy hates the choices of God, and are trying to stop His choices from coming to pass. And maybe the biggest choice they're trying to stop is Psalm 2:6. I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. And they want that, certainly Satan wants to stop that. And he's going to do it through his man on earth, the Antichrist. And they're both going to do it through willing nations, mainly Muslim nations, who have that same hatred of God's election and God's choices of who His people are and who the promises will be fulfilled through. And so that's why Zechariah, the closing chapters of Zechariah talk about, I'm going to make Jerusalem a burdensome stone. I'm going to make Jerusalem heaviness. Just all eyes are on Jerusalem, and all eyes are on the Temple Mount. And so that's why we see from the Bible that Temple Mount, in prophecy at least, is the most valuable piece of real estate on the face of the earth. And all attention will be put on that piece of real estate.
Yeah.
And in some way, however it works out, in some way, Israel will be given the right to access it and use it, either through military victory over those who have stopped her in the past, or through more moderate Muslim countries saying, you know, Israel helped us against Iran, and Iran was ready to tear down the whole world. And Israel, we need to repay them in some way by letting them have some access.
Well,
however it works out.
Look at Jordan. Jordan stepped in.
Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Now it came out both aided Israel in either intelligence, information, access over their airspace to shoot down the missiles before they got to Israel's land, or even may have aided in shooting down some of the missiles themselves. So it wasn't just the Western allies, it was some moderate Islamic nations that helped Israel against Iran.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, we tend to think, I think this is a mistake we've made in the past, we tend to think all of the Islamic nations are going to be aligned against Israel. You read carefully in like Daniel 11, it appeared, it talks about the king of the north and king of the south, and that king of the south that's going to be defeated in some of the battles is named as Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, and northern Africa. And Dedan, Saudi Arabia, is going to be on the sideline saying, why have you come down here to take a spoil? So there's going to be some moderate Islamic nations that are going to be opposed to the super aggressive nature of the Antichrist. They're going to think he goes too far. And they're going to try to slow him down. And he's going to try to destroy them. So there's not going to be unity among the Muslim nations against Israel.
Right.
And, the Bible even talks about God's going to bless some of those regions in the millennial because they were not so evil intentioned against Israel during the tribulation. So, it's much more nuanced and not quite as black and white as we normally make it. There's Israel, then there's all the Muslims want to destroy her.
Right.
It's very clear right now that some of the Muslim nations know it is in their best interest financially to work with Israel because Israel has a lot to offer for their prosperity. And they really hate the idea of someone like Iran trying to mess all that up. So,
another thing I'll just throw in the mix. Why not? The solar eclipse we just went through. These eclipses are really part of God's signs. And so interesting that right around this time on Israel's calendar is another eclipse. That's usually signs. Where they come around Israel's calendar. So God has these things all in sync.
Well, he said in the beginning in Genesis 1, that the main purpose of the sun and the moon and the stars and the heavenly bodies is for signs and seasons, not just seasons, but for signs.
The Moed.
And that's why Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about the signs in the heavens, the sun and the moon and the stars. Well, he's thinking back about Genesis 1 in the beginning. I'm going to use these that I created as evidence of my coming judgment.
There's a lot to unpack, I think, on all of this.
Well, another thing, and I need to get going pretty quick. This is turned into maybe more the Red Heifer offering. But last weekend really got the world's attention that how quickly something like World War III could happen overnight. If Iran had not, and I told the Liberty Church this because this is kind of humorous the way social media is now. And when we think of, we think it's like really poor etiquette to tell important news by text, or something like that. But Iran tweeted, Israel was deciding, should we respond with total force tonight? And so Iran tweeted out this is the end of our hostilities. We consider the matter concluded. That was their way of telling the world, we did this, but we're not going to do more than this, at least not now. That was their way of telling Israel, you can settle down, don't destroy us tonight. And they did it in a tweet. But that's the quickest way to get the news around the world these days, is something like that, because they saw they needed to let the world immediately know, we don't plan further attacks. Because otherwise, if they hadn't notified the world of that, Israel may have just plastered them with all kinds of destruction. And that next day, Sunday, would have been much different than what it ended up being. Now, Israel's probably still going to respond, but it seems obvious they're going to respond in such a way that does not escalate things.
Yeah.
Because they know if they went in and did what some of their more extreme military people want to do, then that would bring the entire world's economy crashing down. They don't want to do that. So you say, well, they need to really make a big statement. Well, they'll figure out a way to make a statement without causing the stock market to crash, hopefully.
Yeah. A couple of nuclear plants would be a nice statement.
Wouldn't it? So all of this feeds, maybe kind of in closing here, all of this feeds, to me, it's real interesting studying the Muslim world. And I've said in some of my end time sessions, the way it's broken down to me is interesting. You got really three major competitors in the Muslim world who want to be the head of the final Islamic caliphate. You have Turkey, because they were the Ottoman caliphate. They were the last major Islamic caliphate that ruled over the entire Middle East, including Israel. So they think it's their right to be the one to revive it again. So that's why they're acting so weird right now. They're part of NATO, but they're really like acting like radical Muslims. Then you have Saudi Arabia, who thinks it should be them because they own the two holiest sites of Islam, Medina and Mecca. That's where the Prophet was from. So they feel it's their right, and they have the greatest influence in the world financially and politically and so forth. So they feel like they're in the place to really be the dominant one. And then there's Iran, because they're Shia Muslim, and they think Sunni Muslims are all heretics, and that their version of Islam is the correct one. Therefore, it should rule. Plus, they are successors of the ancient Persian Empire. So they feel like the Persian Empire should be revived and control that whole part of the world. So those three Islamic countries really are competing for dominance. And to add to that, the Saudi Arabia are Arabs, half brothers to Israel, blood related. They say, well, that doesn't matter. Esau and Ishmael were not that great of brothers, but there's still something about being blood related to Abraham. And that causes those that are, even though they've hated Israel in the past, they're less hateful of Israel than the northern Islamic nations and Eastern Islamic nations like Afghanistan and Iran. They hate Israel with a pure hatred. So there's, in some way, I think that's going to play into those Arab Muslim nations being more moderate toward Israel during the tribulation. The Turkey is Turks. They're not blood related to Israel. So they have an animosity that is outside. And then, of course, Iran is being Persian. So you have Persians and Turks and Arabs that have all fought against each other through history, even though they're all, we tend to think, well, they're all Muslims, so they all get along. No, their history is one of hating and destroying each other as Turks, Arabs, and Persians.
Yeah, pre-Islamic. They
Pre-Islamic.
held those distinctives.
Those ancient hatreds are still there.
Yeah.
And that's all going to play out in the tribute in the 7 years. So we make a big mistake to think that they're all going to be united together against Israel. There's going to be a lot of infighting among them.
Yeah. And some of the alliances that we'll see take place, Brother Rick, will be a combination of Sunni and Shiites. So it's not going to be all Sunni on one side and all Shiites on the other. There'll be a mixture.
So let me take it another step. I don't know. I just thought of this the other day. So the Turks mainly are the dominant ones in the north, along with Iraq and those breakaway nations of Soviet Union. But Turkey is the dominant player. So they could be known as the dominant force and the king of the north in Daniel. And then Saudi Arabia might be the dominant one along with Egypt, the king of the south, and they do battle during that 7 years. And then I thought, okay, where does Iran come in this? Persia. Along with Afghanistan and the eastern, southern, former Soviet Union, connected just north of Iran and Afghanistan and so forth. They may be more likely what Revelation calls the kings of the East. We normally think that's a China army coming over. But that may be those Eastern Islamic nations that gather a great army. And so the king in the north, king in the south, and kings of the East represent the three major forces that are trying to dominate in that final caliphate. And some of these battles we think of that are mainly against Israel or against the West may be partly against each other. Or control. So,
and if it weren't for Islam coming in and the caliphate being on their radar, I don't necessarily see all this activity really necessarily happening against Israel, but that's what's united them all against Israel. And so God is using all these enemies to have a common goal of the caliphate, which the Western Allies dismantled after World War I.
Yeah. So I mean, we united with Russia against Germany in World War II, and yet we considered Russia our enemy. Patton wanted to go into Russia after World War II. We're going to have to fight him anyway, he said. May as well do it now. well, we have all our military over here. So maybe one last thing to go full circle back to your opening statement about Hamas said one of the reasons was because this whole Red Heifer thing. And they knew what that meant to the Jews. They wanted to put a stop to it. Do you remember what they called that attack? What name they gave to it? All these attacks have a name attached to them. What they called that attack against Israel on October 7th? They called it the Al-Aqsa flood. Why did they give it the name of their holy site on the Temple Mount? Well, they gave it the name of that site because maybe they consider what Israel was trying to bring about was trying to destroy that holy Muslim site on the Temple Mount. So they gave it that name. I just find it interesting that they chose that name for their attack against Israel.
They might be thinking that that's where Israel would rebuild the temple. And so if they're chasing this out in their thoughts, that the Red Heifer meant their temple activity, and if the temple, the designated spot was that mosque, then tying it all together, I can see where they would name it that. If they're thinking Israel is going to build it there, it's still on the Temple Mount. Build it there, then I can see where they might designate.
Well, yeah, they may have given it that name for a simple reason, something like, we're going to show you that we'll go to all lengths to protect our holy site on that Temple Mount. It's not yours, it's ours.
Yeah.
So this is our way of showing that we're going to stop any effort you make.
Yeah.
So anyway, those who listen and watch to this later, we don't apologize, but we do acknowledge that we were all over the map today. And somehow we talked about the Red Heifer offering and its connection to Christ. That part's good. And then we tried to put on our prophet's hat and talk about current events. But, I think all of us are thinking about, what happened over the weekend brought it right back to the front burner, didn't it? Mm-hmm. We need to really be thinking about prophecy in the end times, because it could be sprung on us at any time.
Yeah.
And another closing thought, with Iran getting involved directly, with all these nations having to come in to be a part of this, mm-hmm. all the Western nations, the Daniel 11 talks about the ships of Kittim mm-hmm. stopping the antichrist at some point in one of his military efforts. That's kind of what just happened in a sense. It's kind of a precursor to that. The Western nations came in and stopped a lot of what Iran was trying to do to help Israel. They helped Israel. So we're seeing how a lot of this might get worked out. And what we're seeing is this is the buildup to where an actual all-out regional war could break out. Mm-hmm. Easily at almost any time, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. that would require the Russia, China, Japan, and the Western nations, those who really have the wealth and power in this world, to step in and insist some sort of peace treaty be signed, mm-hmm. or else the economy of the world is going to go down the tubes, mm-hmm. and we're not going to stand for it.
Yeah.
But we don't quite know what the terms of that covenant should be. And this man who rises up among a small number of people, so he's kind of unknown until then,
right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Says, I think I have a possible solution.
Yeah, yeah.
He offers it.
Yeah.
And they think, why didn't we think of that? Mm-hmm. And so the whole world wanders after the beast, because mm-hmm. he's going to have some answers that the greatest political minds in the world have not come up with. Mm-hmm. And it's going to appear to work.
Yeah.
Because it appears to work so well, on the verge of total destruction, possibly, that they're going to give him unlimited power. Mm-hmm. So that's my closing scenario, that all this, and it, we've said this for most of our life, so we'll say it once again. It could happen very soon. Mm-hmm. It really could. But it appears right now that it's more likely than ever before. Mm-hmm. It happens soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you're of a certain eschatological persuasion, you don't have to worry about any of this. You won't be here.
I listened to some of these pre-tribulation so-called Bible experts, and they'll offer some really good information about some of these prophecies and what's going to happen, and the order of events during the tribulation and antichrist. And they go into great detail and sometimes say a lot of real interesting, probably correct things. But then they kind of set the end. Aren't you glad we're not going to be here? I'm thinking, why do you go through so much effort to figure it all out if we're going to be gone, rejoicing in heaven?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks all of you for putting up with our running around the mulberry bush session today.
Well, like you said, we were all over the map. We were all over the Middle Eastern map today.
We hope you got something out of it. If nothing else, how wrong we were and how you need to correct us. So invite yourself to come on, and we would love for someone, even by next session, to say, I'd like to come on with you and offer some thoughts that were different than what you offered. And we will give you plenty of time.
Yes.
Yeah, we'd be glad to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't hold your breath, Mike, but I sure hope someone does.
Yeah.
I hope someone takes us up on it.
We'll see. Until then, adios.
Until next time.
Until next time. Thanks for viewing, everyone.